He advanced tech of the Roman Empire. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back. About 2,000 years. So, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket that's seen better days. And let's wander softly through one of history's more impressive contradictions. An empire so advanced, it built aqueducts that still stand today. But also thought lead pipes were a neat idea for drinking water, because of course they did. The Romans, conquerors, administrators, amateur plumbers. They built roads that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting far-flung provinces like the veins of a very smug marble statue, and they did it mostly by hand, and occasionally by enslaved people, because, well, progress comes with paperwork and moral compromise. But before we get too far into the nuts and bolts, or, more accurately, the stones and arches, let's ease into the world they built. The air in a Roman city was heavy with the smell of olive oil, smoke, and ambition. Men in tunics debated law in the forum, while others shouted over fish prices in the markets. In the distance, you'd hear the steady clank of metal from a blacksmith's forge, the sound of progress. Or possibly just someone making yet another bronze statue of Jupiter. And behind all of this, the quiet hum of technology, a civilization so mechanically clever that even their concrete has survived better than some of our modern politicians' reputations. Let's start with something soothing. The Roman road. We still say, all roads lead to Rome, and for once, that cliché was actually true. Roman engineers designed an entire empire's circulatory system out of stone, gravel, and pure stubbornness. They built straight roads, not just because it was efficient, but because Romans didn't believe in the concept of a round. If there was a mountain in the way, they'd either go through it or on top of it. The word zigzag did not exist in Latin, or if it did, they politely ignored it. Each road had multiple layers, compacted sand, crushed stone, and tightly fitted paving slabs, all slanted slightly to let rainwater drain off the sides. 2,000 years later, we're still struggling to figure out how to fill a pothole without an existential crisis, but the roads were more than infrastructure. They were statements. They told every province, you are connected, you are seen, and we can march a legion to your doorstep faster than you can say Ave Caesar. It's quite touching. Really, in an authoritarian sort of way. Next, let's drift gently toward the aqueducts. Those beautiful arches striding across the countryside like giant stone centipedes. Imagine this, fresh water flowing from mountain springs, gliding across miles of countryside, and arriving in a city of marble fountains, public baths, and people who bathed more often than their medieval descendants would for the next 1,000 years. The Romans loved their baths. Public bathing was not just hygiene, it was social networking, gossip, and sometimes light business fraud. But to feed all those shimmering pools, they needed water, and the aqueducts were their answer, silent, graceful, unstoppable, built on perfect gradients. Some so subtle they dropped only a few inches per mile. They carried clean water to cities, housing hundreds of thousands of people. When you stand beneath an aqueduct today, say, the Pont du Gard in France, you can almost hear it whispering across centuries, yes, we really were that good. Of course, the Romans being Romans, they eventually decided to pipe all that fresh, pure water through lead. Because nothing says engineering genius quite like slow neurological poisoning. It's debated whether lead contributed to Rome's eventual decline. Probably not as much as corruption, economic instability, and a fondness for setting emperors on fire. But still, it didn't help. And speaking of emperors, let's glide now toward one of the more dazzling bits of Roman technological ego. The Colosseum. Imagine it under a twilight sky. The arena glowing with oil lamps. The air thick with the smell of roasted meat and cheap wine. Built in the 1st century AD, it could hold around 50,000 spectators, or possibly one very determined emperor and his inflated sense of importance. The engineering behind it was quietly brilliant. Complex systems of ramps, elevators, and trapdoors allowed animals, gladiators, and occasionally stage props to appear from nowhere, a kind of ancient special effect. There were pulleys, winches, counterweights, all powered by human muscle. Somewhere beneath the arena, dozens of exhausted slaves were pulling ropes so lions could pop up dramatically at just the right moment. It was violent, yes, but also oddly theatrical, a culture that could turn mass slaughter into an afternoon matinee. They even flooded the arena at times for mock naval battles. Imagine that an entire amphitheater transformed into a temporary lake, ships clashing in front of a roaring audience, all because one emperor wanted to prove he had the bigger budget. The Colosseum, for all its grim history, remains a testament to engineering audacity. It shouldn't have worked, but it did, and to millennia later, it still stands, while many modern stadiums require renovation after about 10 years and a small fortune now. Let's drift a little closer to home life. Not everything in Rome was marble and glory. A lot of it was plumbing and clever improvisation. Roman houses, particularly the wealthier ones, often had underfloor heating, they were called. Here's how it worked. The floor was raised on small pillars, leaving a hollow space underneath. Hot air from a nearby furnace would circulate beneath the rooms, gently warming the floor and occasionally setting the place on fire if the servants weren't paying attention. It was cozy, efficient, and yet again centuries ahead of its time. The average Roman patrician could enjoy a warm bath, a heated floor, and a meal of imported oysters, while the average Briton at the time was still wondering how to make a roof that didn't leak. This kind of comfort came from a deep understanding of materials. Roman builders invented concrete that could set underwater, a marvel of chemistry that even modern scientists had to reverse engineer. They mixed lime, volcanic ash, and seawater, creating a self-healing material that got stronger over time. Our modern concrete, by contrast, tends to crumble like a neglected cookie after a few decades. The Romans would likely be appalled, or perhaps smug, probably both. One of my favorite pieces of Roman innovation, though, is something wonderfully simple: the calendar. Before Julius Caesar reformed it in 46 BC, Rome's timekeeping system was, let's say, optimistic. It involved priests occasionally adding or skipping months whenever politics required it. If an ally's term in office needed to last longer, well, just extend the year. Naturally, chaos ensued. So Caesar, ever the man who liked to take credit for order, consulted Egyptian astronomers and created what we now call the Julian calendar. 365 days, with a leap year every 4, a system so elegant that we still use its descendant today. Sure, the Pope had to tweak it a bit later, because of course he did. But the bones of our timekeeping still belong to Rome. There's a strange comfort in that when you check your calendar app, you're still obeying the logic of an empire that collapsed 15 centuries ago. And while we're on the subject of time, Let's drift into another Roman specialty. Organization. Rome thrived not just on conquest, but on paperwork. Bureaucracy was its real superpower. They had census records, tax forms, postal routes, and all of it meticulously kept on scrolls, tablets, and bits of wax. Somewhere in the heart of the empire, there were undoubtedly clerks who lived and died surrounded by the ancient equivalent of filing cabinets. Imagine the hum of styluses scratching on wax, the soft shuffle of sandals on marble floors, the faint sighs of men who would never, ever catch up on their paperwork. Their postal system, cursus publicus, was remarkably fast for its day. Messages could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, relayed by horse, by courier, or sometimes by sheer panic if the message involved the emperor. It's oddly humanizing. Beneath the marble busts and grand titles, Rome was held together by a network of tired, efficient civil servants, the unsung heroes of empire. Let's move now, slowly, toward the world of medicine, if we can call it that. Roman doctors were an interesting mix of insight and superstition. They understood anatomy surprisingly well, especially thanks to battlefield experience, but they also believed in balancing bodily humors. Too much phlegm, try a nice vomit. Feeling sad, maybe your black bile is off. And yet, amid all that cheerful quackery, there were moments of genuine brilliance. They performed cataract surgery with fine needles. They used surgical tools we'd recognize today, scalpels, forceps, bone saws. They sterilized instruments with wine or vinegar, not out of germ theory, which they didn't know, but because it smelled clean and seemed sensible. Sometimes that's all science is, doing something that feels right until someone invents a microscope, asterisk. And then there's entertainment, because even the most advanced civilizations need to unwind. Beyond the Colosseum, there were theaters, circuses, and chariot races that made today's sports fans look positively restrained. The Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 people. Crowds screamed for their favorite teams, the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, the Whites, and occasionally rioted so hard that emperors feared for their throne. It's comforting to know that sports-related chaos is not a modern invention. And in between races, Rome was full of music, pantomime, and recitations, some of it highbrow, much of it not. Juvenal, the satirist, once complained that the people cared only for bread and circuses, food and fun, and honestly, can you blame them now? As we close this first stretch of our journey through Rome's quietly dazzling technology, it's worth pausing because the Romans weren't magical. They didn't have microchips or electricity or even decent soap. But what they did have was persistence. They built things to last: roads, aqueducts, walls, and languages. Even now, our architecture, our laws, and even our words, forum, senate, emperor, still echo their world. And maybe that's the secret. Not the genius of invention, but the determination to make something that might outlast a lifetime. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine the glow of oil lamps on stone walls, the quiet murmur of water through aqueducts, and the distant rumble of wheels on Roman roads. The empire sleeps now, but its echoes never really stopped. Asterisk, the young Theodora, from performer to power. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the city of Constantinople. It's the early 6th century, that hazy, half-forgotten twilight between the fall of Rome and the rise of everything else. The marbles chipped, The baths are a little grimy, but the empire still insists it's eternal, so get comfortable, dim the lights, let the day fade out, and let's follow the faint sound of sandals on mosaics, through the streets where incense lingers, markets hum, and somewhere in the background, someone is definitely overcharging for dates. This is the world Theodora was born into. A city that thought it was the center of everything, and in a way, it was. Constantinople sat glittering between two worlds, Christian and pagan, East and West, sanity and politics. And Theodora, well, she would somehow manage to stand right in the middle of all of it. When Theodora was born, around the year 500, her prospects were about as low as they could be without being an actual stray cat. Her father, Acacius, was the keeper of bears for the city's hippodrome, which, while technically a government job, was not a glamorous one. His job title literally involved making sure the animals that mauled people for entertainment were in a good mood. Her mother, whose name we don't know, worked as a dancer and actress, which, in Byzantine society, was considered roughly equivalent to being publicly unemployed but with better costumes, so little Theodora began life in a world of noise, fur, and faintly sweaty ambition. The hippodrome was the beating heart of Constantinople. Think of it as a mix between a racetrack, a sports stadium, and a political arena. The people came for chariot races, the blues versus the greens, but they stayed for the riots. And amid all that chaos, Theodora's childhood played out backstage, while other children might have grown up surrounded by books or tutors. She grew up surrounded by animal trainers, acrobats, and performers who knew how to charm a crowd, or at least distract it long enough for the emperor to escape. Her father died when she was still young, which made life significantly worse. Her mother left with 3 daughters and absolutely no savings, did what anyone in her position would. She tried to get her husband's old job passed, down to one of her children. It didn't work. Apparently, the hippodrome authorities weren't keen on employing young girls as bear keepers. Imagine that. Desperate, Theodora's mother turned to the audience, literally. During one of the races, she paraded her daughters through the stands, begging the factions, the blues and the greens, to take pity. They didn't. The blues ignored her, and the greens, to their credit, eventually helped, though not out of pure kindness. The factions often used charity as a form of recruitment. Nothing says loyalty like rescuing a family from starvation and then expecting lifelong devotion, so Theodora and her family became affiliated with the Greens, a decision that, as we'll see later, did not age well by her early teens. Theodora had joined the world she'd grown up watching, the world of performers, dancers, and actresses. And in 6th century Constantinople, actress could mean many things. Some of them involved acting. Most of them did not. Theodora became a performer known for her beauty, her wit, and her absolute lack of hesitation when it came to scandal. Contemporary writers, most of whom hated her, claimed she performed in comedic plays that left little to the imagination. Procopius, who wrote The Secret History, described her acts in such gleefully salacious detail that it reads less like history and more like a very bitter Yelp review. Now, it's worth noting that Procopius had a personal vendetta. He adored Theodora's husband, Emperor Justinian, but detested her. So he described her early life in tones of moral horror, calling her shameless and depraved, which, in translation, usually means confident and successful, still, even allowing for bias. Theodora's early career was almost certainly rough. Performers lived precariously, dependent on patronage, gossip, and the whims of men who thought generosity began and ended with dinner. She traveled possibly to North Africa, maybe to Antioch, always on the edge of survival, sometimes the favorite of wealthy men, sometimes left behind when the money ran out, and yet, through all that instability, she seems to have developed something rare for her world: awareness. She watched how power worked, who had it, who didn't, and what masks people wore to pretend otherwise. By the time she was in her early 20s, Theodora was done being decorative. After a disastrous relationship with a provincial governor, which ended about as well as you'd expect, she returned to Constantinople with a firm dislike for rich men and a sharper sense of purpose. She gave up performing. Instead, she began spinning wool to support herself. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it kept her within the city's walls. And then, somewhere in that hum of daily life, perhaps at church, or through mutual friends, or simply through gossip, she met Justinian. Asterisk at the time, he wasn't yet emperor, just a rising bureaucrat from the Balkans, ambitious, intelligent, and oddly pious for someone climbing the greasy pole of imperial politics. He was also about 40. She was about 20. And he fell in love almost immediately, which must have been quite a surprise to everyone, including himself. You see, Roman law at the time made it illegal for men of rank to marry actresses or former performers. Theodora was, officially, unsuitable in every possible way. Naturally, that made him adore her even more. It's hard to know what she saw in him. Perhaps she liked that he wasn't from one of the old aristocratic families, that he, like her, had clawed his way upward. Or maybe she appreciated that he saw her not as a scandal, but as a partner. Whatever the case, they became inseparable. Justinian petitioned his uncle, Emperor Justin I, to change the law so that he could marry her. And because Justinian was essentially running the empire by that point anyway, the emperor did so in 525. Theodora went from former actress and probable scandal to the future empress of the Roman Empire, which is quite a career change. When she entered the palace, Theodora brought with her not just grace or beauty, but a sharp mind, even her enemies, and she had many admitted she was intelligent. She had a knack for reading people, for staying calm while others panicked, and for saying exactly what needed to be said, even if it wasn't polite. Asterisk. She also had a long memory. The same blues faction that had refused to help her as a child suddenly became her husband's supporters, and she made sure they remembered her face. Still, she wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. She built hospitals, supported shelters for women, and worked to outlaw forced prostitution reforms that historians still credit as some of the earliest recognitions of women's rights in Byzantine law. But beneath her quiet composure, she carried an iron sense of self-preservation. She had spent her childhood watching power destroy people who didn't understand it. Now that she finally had it, she wasn't going to let it go easily. Let's pause here for a moment, because it's easy to let the centuries blur together: emperors, crowns, silk, and incense. But imagine what this must have felt like for Theodora herself, a girl who once begged in the hippodrome, now walking through the same stands in royal robes, looking down at the crowds who used to throw scraps. The empire loved a story like that. The poor girl turned empress, the divine sign that anyone, if sufficiently cunning, could rise. Of course, not everyone loved it. The court was full of men who had spent their lives climbing the ladder of power. only to watch a woman with a past skip a few rungs. They whispered, they sneered, they waited for her to slip. She did in single quotes. By the time Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora was not just his consort, but his closest advisor. He consulted her on policy, theology, and diplomacy. He gave her her own throne beside his, something previous empresses had never enjoyed, and, perhaps most tellingly, he listened to her. She sat beside him in council meetings, spoke openly, and made decisions that stuck. Foreign ambassadors recorded that she seemed unshakable, calm, deliberate, with a quiet authority that unnerved anyone expecting her to be ornamental, Procopius, ever the gossip, admitted that no one could influence Justinian as she could. He meant it as an insult. History tends to read it as something else entirely. In the palace, she created her own circle. Artists, philosophers, clergy, and women who had once been as powerless as she was. She gave them positions, protection, and patronage. Theodora had learned the rules of her world, that wealth and beauty could open doors, but only alliances could keep them open, and she was patient. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She just needed to wait until everyone else finished arguing, and then speak softly enough that they realized she was right. We'll drift further into her reign later. The riots, the plagues, the palaces that burned, and the way she stood unmoving when half the empire wanted her dead. But for tonight, as we leave her in those early years of imperial power, let's linger on the quiet transformation she made possible, not just for herself, but for the story of what a woman could be in a world built entirely for men. From the hippodrome sands to the imperial throne, she became the axis around which one of history's greatest empires turned elegant, dangerous, and endlessly uncouth. So, as the lights of Constantinople fade in your mind's eye, imagine the shimmer of lamplight on gold mosaics, the murmur of distant hymns, and somewhere, perhaps, the faint laughter of a girl who managed to rewrite her own fate. Asterisk the rise of the Teutonic Order, 12th, 14th centuries. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a colder, quieter Europe, one filled with misty forests, slow rivers, and an awful lot of people wearing chainmail for reasons that rarely ended well. Go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe make some tea that tastes faintly of history. Something herbal, possibly regret-flavored, because tonight we're tracing the rise of the Teutonic Order, a group of German knights who somehow decided that the best way to prove their devotion to God was to build a militarized state on the edge of the known world. It's a story of crusading monks, frozen frontiers, and deeply questionable decision-making, all told at a pace that should help you fall asleep long before anyone swings a sword. We begin in the late 12th century, during the Age of Crusades, that period when Europe's nobility decided that wandering off to the Holy Land was the fashionable way to solve spiritual anxiety. The First Crusade had already come and gone, leaving behind a confusing map of small Christian kingdoms, surrounded by people who understandably weren't thrilled about them. By the time of the Third Crusade, around 1190, the novelty had worn off a little. The weather was too hot, the logistics were terrible, and most of the knights had started to realize that marching across deserts in armor was perhaps not the best idea humanity ever had. But still, the flow of pious adventurers continued, and among them were Germans, many of them from small towns with big ambitions. During the Siege of Acre, one of those chaotic, overcrowded coastal cities where crusaders tended to congregate and catch diseases. A small group of German merchants and pilgrims decided to do something practical for once. They founded a hospital dedicated to caring for the sick and wounded. They named it after the Virgin Mary, and they staffed it with volunteers who, despite being in the middle of a war zone, still found time to argue about proper German grammar. That modest hospital, born out of dust, heat, and confusion, would eventually evolve into one of the most powerful military orders in Europe. But for now, they were just the hospital guys. Like most medieval institutions, the Teutonic Order started with good intentions and then slowly turned into an armed geopolitical nightmare at first. They followed the example of the Knights Hospitaller, who ran hospitals, and the Templars, who ran everything else. They combined elements of both piety and profit, medicine and militancy. Because nothing says Christian charity quite like handing out soup in one hand and a sword in the other. They gained official recognition from the Pope in 1198, a good year for ambitious clerical paperwork. Their full name became the Order of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem, a title so long it could double as a sleep aid. Their symbol was a black cross on a white background, simple, stark, easily visible through fog, blood, and moral ambiguity. When the Crusader states began collapsing, as they inevitably did, the Teutonic Order found itself in need of new business opportunities. They had soldiers, they had organization, but they no longer had much of a holy land to defend. So, naturally, they started looking around for other places to conquer. It's the medieval equivalent of an overstaffed corporation saying, well, the Middle East didn't work out. How about the Baltic? And thus, their attention turned north to Eastern Europe, where pagan tribes still lived, worshipping forests, rivers, and the occasional bear for the ambitious knight with an unused sword and an unused conscience. It was perfect. Before long, the Teutonic Order was invited, somewhat recklessly, to Hungary in 1211. King Andrew II asked them to help defend his eastern frontier, the Transylvanian region of Burzenland, from raids by nomadic groups. They agreed, arrived promptly, built fortresses, converted a few locals, and then, in a move that should surprise no one, decided they rather liked the place. They began ruling the land as if it were their own. They minted coins, built castles, tried to attract settlers. Basically, they acted like new homeowners who start redecorating before signing the lease. King Andrew noticed, and in 1225, he politely asked them to leave. By politely, I mean he sent an army. The Teutonic Knights were expelled from Hungary, but they didn't go far. They had discovered that they enjoyed having their own territory, and before long, they found another monarch willing to take the risk. That monarch was Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish noble with a small problem. His pagan neighbors, the old Prussians, kept raiding his lands. Conrad needed help. He needed warriors. He needed someone overly zealous and mildly unhinged. So, in 1226, he invited the Teutonic Order to come north and deal with the PRUSSIANS. They agreed enthusiastically, but, and this is important, they also asked the Holy Roman Emperor to grant them full sovereignty over whatever lands they conquered. In other words, sure, we'll help, but if we win, it's ours. The Emperor, Frederick II, agreed, probably while distracted by something else. He issued the Golden Bull of Rimini, giving the order sweeping rights over any pagan territories they could subdue. And just like that, the Teutonic Knights became landowners. Or, to put it less romantically, they became colonizers with better armor. The campaign to Christianize, or more accurately, to militarily reorganize the Baltic region began. The Prussian tribes resisted fiercely. They knew the forests better, they fought guerrilla style, and they had the distinct advantage of not being weighed down by 20 kilograms of steel. But the order was relentless. They built fortified bases, advanced slowly, and brought in settlers from Germany. Where they couldn't conquer, they negotiated. Where they couldn't negotiate, they built castles until negotiation seemed the better option. This slow grinding process took decades, but by the mid-13th century, the Teutonic Order had carved out a state, the monastic state of the Teutonic Knights, stretching along the Baltic coast. It was a place where every stone fortress doubled as a monastery, and every monastery doubled as a tax office. Asterisk. Their headquarters moved to Marienburg, modern Malbork in Poland, a brick fortress so massive that it still looks mildly threatening even in tourist photos. The architecture was pure efficiency. Red brick, square towers, long, echoing halls perfect for both prayer and passive-aggressive meetings. Inside, life was rigid and predictable. The knights lived by strict monastic rules: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Though, like most institutions that claimed poverty, they were astonishingly good at collecting wealth. Their daily routine involved prayer, meals in silence, training, and administration. Lots of administration. The Teutonic Order was essentially the medieval world's most disciplined tax collector. They divided their territories into commonaries, small districts run by commanders, or comtes, all overseen by a grand master. The whole thing functioned with military precision and religious bureaucracy. Two things medieval Europe adored almost as much as relics and wars. They drained swamps, cleared forests, built towns. They founded ports that would later grow into cities. Places like Königsberg, which, if you're keeping track, means King's Mountain, a subtle hint of ambition. The locals were converted, sometimes by persuasion, often by sword. Pagans were baptized en masse, usually in rivers, which made it easier to tell if anyone tried to run. And then came the Livonian Crusade, the northern expansion of their mission, after merging with the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, an earlier, smaller order that had somehow managed to lose almost all its knights in battle. The Teutonic Order gained control over even more territory soon. They ruled not just Prussia, but much of modern Latvia and Estonia. Their states stretched across the Baltic like a long, cold experiment in religious governance for the first time. A monastic order controlled an actual country with peasants, trade routes, and, most dangerously, opinions. Now, from the outside, it all looked impressively organized, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The order's power relied on continuous crusading. War justified their existence, their wealth, and their recruitment, but the longer they ruled, the fewer pagans there were left to fight. By the early 14th century, the knights had to get creative. They started inviting foreign nobles to join crusades in Prussia, essentially. Week-long military vacations with the spiritual benefits of a full pilgrimage, and none of the sand it became. Fashionable among Western knights, a Baltic holiday with murder and prayer included. Even the future King Henry IV of England made the trip. He went home impressed, slightly and very glad to leave. The Teutonic Order's reputation peaked around 1309. when they formally moved their headquarters from Venice to Marienburg. Venice had been convenient during their Mediterranean phase, but the Baltic was now their real stage. At its height, their state was both pious and paranoid. They maintained diplomatic relations with popes and emperors, traded amber and grain, and built a navy to control the Baltic Sea. And yet, for all their discipline, they couldn't quite resist the temptation to be slightly tyrannical. Their rule was absolute, their justice system swift, severe, and their taxes impressively thorough. It turns out that when monks become kings, they collect tithes with terrifying efficiency, and so, through the 13th and 14th centuries, the Teutonic Order stood like a wall between Latin Europe and the vast forests of the East. They saw themselves as guardians of Christendom. Others saw them as heavily armed accountants with a messiah complex. Both views were true. The Order's expansion, while cloaked in divine purpose, also served very human ambitions, land, trade, and power. They claimed to fight for God, but they also fought for salt mines, river tolls, and control of the Baltic grain trade. It was, in short, a holy empire with an excellent balance sheet. As the centuries turned, they had become what every empire eventually becomes: comfortable, confident, and quietly unprepared for what came next. But that's for another night. For now, let's leave them standing on the snowy ramparts of Marienburg, the cold wind moving through the banners, the iron bells tolling across the frozen river, a state built on vows and stone, a brotherhood that conquered the wilderness and then, inevitably, had to figure out how to rule it. Sleep, as they rarely did, because tomorrow, even in God's service, there would be taxes to collect, pagans to baptize, and meetings to attend. Asterisk the love and scandal of Mark Antony and Cleopatra for 130 BCE. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the warm, golden haze of the late Roman Republican age that was, like most golden ages, mostly chaos wrapped in good lighting. So, settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe let the hum of your fan do the heavy lifting while we explore one of history's most famous power couples, Mark Antony and Cleopatra. To people so famous for their love, it's easy to forget that their relationship helped kill a republic, start an empire, and give Latin teachers endless material for 2,000 years. And yet, beneath all the marble statues and dramatic retellings, the real Antony and Cleopatra were, well, very human, which is to say, messy, emotional, and prone to decisions that look profoundly ill-advised when viewed from any angle other than, I'm in love. Let's drift back to the world they lived in. Rome was groaning under the weight of its own ambition. The Republic had been around for nearly 5 centuries, and by this point, it was less a system of governance and more a polite suggestion that everyone ignored. Civil war was practically a national hobby. Politicians hired private armies to make points during debates, and retirement usually meant assassination. Into this picture walked Mark Antony. He was, by all accounts, a man who lived exactly as he pleased. He was handsome, at least, in the way Roman men liked to think they were: tall, muscular, slightly disheveled, and exuding the confidence of someone who could drink everyone under the table. Antony came from a noble family, though his early years were less aristocratic upbringing and more barely functional chaos. His father, Marcus Antonius Creticus, was such a terrible naval commander that even pirates laughed at him. His mother, Julia, however, was related to Julius Caesar, which turned out to be a much better career move. By the time Antony was in his 30s, he'd already earned a reputation as Caesar's loyal right hand, Menand Rome's most extravagant party guest. He was the kind of man who could deliver a rousing speech in the Senate one morning and wake up in someone else's villa the next, surrounded by empty amphorae and regret. Then, of course, there was Cleopatra, the seventh Philippi, last queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, a dynasty that had managed to rule for nearly 300 years without learning how to speak Egyptian fluently. The Ptolemies were Greek, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, and had perfected the art of royal dysfunction. They married their siblings, feuded violently, and threw each other into prison as part of normal family life by the time Cleopatra took the throne. Egypt was more of a Greek-run business than an independent kingdom. But Cleopatra was different. She was brilliant, charismatic, and perhaps most dangerously she understood Rome. She spoke at least 7 languages, read philosophy, and knew that the only thing keeping Egypt alive was its usefulness to Roman politics. Her first famous Roman entanglement, of course, was Julius Caesar. When she met him, she was about 21. Caesar was in his 50s and already a legend. Cleopatra, in a move that can only be described as bold even by Netflix standards, had herself smuggled into his presence, rolled up in a carpet or possibly a laundry bag. Depending on which ancient gossip you believe, it worked. Caesar was impressed, amused, and probably flattered. Soon, the two were inseparable, and Cleopatra became something of an unofficial queen in Rome. She gave birth to Caesar's son, whom she named Caesarion, literally, Little Caesar. Yes, that's really what it means. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. She likely assumed that Rome's next strongman would come knocking eventually. She was right. Enter Mark Antony. It was 41 BCE, and Antony was in the middle of dividing up the eastern provinces after Caesar's death. Cleopatra had stayed conspicuously neutral during the wars, which annoyed him. So he summoned her to the city of Tarsus Medante Turkatu. Explain herself. This is where things started to become the stuff of legend. Cleopatra didn't just show up to Tarsus. She arrived. Ancient writers, who loved a good bit of spectacle, describe her sailing up the river Cynus in a golden barge with purple sails, silver oars, and attendants dressed as cupids fanning her with feathers. Perfume drifted over the water. Music played. Antony, who was supposed to be interrogating her, ended up inviting her to dinner instead. It's difficult to say how much of this is true. Ancient historians weren't exactly subtle with exaggeration, but even if half of it happened, it's easy to see why Antony was enthralled. Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing. For Antony, the relationship was intoxicating, literally and politically. Cleopatra represented not just power, but luxury, an entire kingdom of it. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket, rich in grain, gold, and glamour. Rome, by contrast, was perpetually covered in dust and corruption. The two fell into each other's orbit completely. Depravity, which usually meant doing anything fun. They formed a group called the Inimitable Livers, whose main purpose was to eat, drink, and prank the city. It was less a royal court and more a high-budget reality show, of course. Word of Antony's behavior reached Rome, his enemies, especially Octavian. The young heir of Julius Caesar used it to paint Antony as a man bewitched by an Eastern temptress, which, to be fair, was at least half true. Still, Antony tried to maintain some balance. He returned to Rome briefly, married Octavian's sister Octavia as a gesture of goodwill, and pretended everything was fine. But diplomacy was not his strength. Within a few years, he was back in Egypt, back with Cleopatra, and very much not pretending anymore. Together, they ruled the East as though they were gods. Literally, Antony took the title of Dionysus, and Cleopatra was Isis. They had twins, named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, which translates to the sun and the moon. Subtlety was not their strong suit. Rome, meanwhile, grew increasingly scandalized. The idea that a Roman general had effectively set up a second empire abroad, with an Egyptian queen at his side, was too much for the Senate. Octavian began to position himself as the savior of Roman virtue against the decadence of Antony and Cleopatra. It was brilliant propaganda. He released Antony's will to the public, claiming it left vast Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Whether it was true didn't matter. The damage was done. By 32 BCE, war was inevitable. Officially, Rome declared war on Cleopatra. Not Antony, a neat trick that made the conflict sound patriotic rather than personal. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were larger, but Octavian's navy, commanded by his admiral Agrippa, was better disciplined. In the middle of the fighting, Cleopatra's ship suddenly turned and fled. Antony, naturally, followed her. Their fleet disintegrated soon after. It's still debated whether Cleopatra panicked or had some strategy in mind. Either way, that retreat marked the end of their empire of two. They fled back to Alexandria, and the following year, Octavian arrived at the city gates. Antony's remaining forces surrendered. Facing defeat, Antony fell on his sword, though not especially effectively. When he learned Cleopatra was still alive, he had himself carried to her mausoleum, where he died in her arms. Cleopatra followed soon after, famously by snake bite or, perhaps poison, or a hairpin. No one knows for sure. What mattered was the message. If she couldn't be queen, she wouldn't be paraded through Rome as a trophy. Octavian, now Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. Antony and Cleopatra became legend. Their story was retold, endlessly, as romance, as cautionary tale, as political theatre. But under all that myth, what remains is something remarkably human. Two ambitious, flawed, passionate people trying to rule the world and finding that love, politics, and survival rarely mix well. So, as the candlelight fades in Alexandria, and the sands of the desert settle once again, we can almost hear the last echoes of their laughter in the marble horse, two figures who wanted to be gods, and ended, instead, as ghosts. Let's drift now, gently, to another story of royal ambition and downfall.